Goeiedag, good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. Lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you.
Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world, and welcome to tonight's live stream. And of course, a big shout out to the Loving Life family who are here most nights. Okay, tonight we're going to have a complete and utter change in direction. We're talking about Stellenbosch University, which made the news a few weeks ago when it was revealed that students were banned from speaking Afrikaans on the university grounds, in their dormitories, at lectures, or even in the toilets. Can you believe it? Here is a short video of the historic Stellenbosch University, just to get us onto the subject. Okay, there you go. What an amazing institution. Well, I don't know about now, but it used to be, let's put it that way. All right, tonight I'm talking to Dean Dart from the Anglo-Afrikaner Union about the university, race relations, and the future for young people in South Africa. Please remember to register on lovinglifetv.com to be kept informed and ask your questions for Dean in the side chat. And I should let you know some really exciting news. By the end of this week, we should have a number of new contributing channels, probably up to about 10 up on lovinglivetv.com. And this is an area we're working on right now with Rudy and Gareth. And we're also working on having a live feed at the top of lovinglivetv.com. So you can actually just watch the scrolling text and take the link from that scrolling text to see the latest updates made to the channel. So there's some huge developments happening on Loving Live TV, as I promised just a few days ago. Okay, let's get the show on the road, shall we? Hi, Dean.
Good evening, Scott. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. For a moment, I thought you weren't there.
No.
Now,
I'm here present and all ready to roll.
Good. Now, I can only just see your icon at the moment.
All right, let's quickly see. I'm hoping the video is... All right, let's see if it comes through. All right, so you able to see me?
Yes, now I am. That's much better. Much better. Right. Now, Dean.
Yes.
You're a young man growing up in South Africa. And
yes.
Before we get on to the Anglo-Afrikaner Union and what it's all about and where South Africa is going, tell me a bit about your history growing up in South Africa.
So South Africa is a very, very big place. And people who often stay in one place often don't have a concept of scale as to the sheer size of South Africa. So I often make the joke with people to say that I was born in a small town called Urals, because I'm from Urals af.
Urals means everywhere.
Yes.
Just for those who don't speak Afrikaans.
Yeah, so I'd lived in many different provinces in South Africa. As those who may not have known, South Africa was increased by 5 additional provincial administrations after 1994. So out of those 5, I've lived in the 6 provinces in South Africa. And I will tell you, it's been quite a trek, to say the least.
Yeah. Well, you would have seen South Africa change, I guess, but not as much as older people would have. Because were you a young boy in 1994?
I was only born in 1994. I myself am part of the generation of born frees, as they're otherwise known.
Yeah.
Which is a very interesting generation. I must say, we were also the first generation to go through the entirety of the new schooling system and received all the so-called blue pills that was required for the de-apartheidification program, which was otherwise employed in our secondary and primary schooling education system at the time.
Yeah. Now, before we get on to the Anglo-Afrikaner Union, give us an update on what's happening at Stellenbosch, because the last I heard, Afrikaans had been banned from, you can't speak Afrikaans at the university. What's the latest update on that?
Well, in respect to the Anglo-Afrikaner Union, I must just say this, that it is now 4 years since our fight at the university as a union had started under the Anglo-Afrikaner Student Union, when we had first initiated our first campaign. And I'm very proud to say that since then we had finally made it onto the front page of South Africa's largest and oldest student publication, which was the Mati, and we made the front page. And what otherwise has been happening is today, on this particular day, which is a very auspicious day, in as far as the conceptualization and in actioning of the idea of the Anglo-Afrikaner Union came out all of the reports in relation to Wim de Villiers, who had served testimony at the South African Human Rights Commission in relation to what you had mentioned now. And in as far as they're concerned, the language problem at the university has been solved, and that there's no need to worry or have any worry about what will happen to Afrikaans in the future at the institution is what the rector has been trying to convey to the public. And furthermore, when we take a look at what has been said in his statement, which was otherwise made publicly available to those who might be interested. Otherwise, he has stated that he and the institution hold solidly to the preamble of the Constitution, which is essentially the lens through which a person is supposed to understand or the Constitution, and that is that we, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of the past. And so what is happening is now is that we have a lens through which we are told to perceive the world, which is that we are supposed to recognize the injustices of the past. But what we are seeing in places like Stellenbosch is the injustice that is transpiring now, which is not being acknowledged. And we are looking at an institution such as the Human Rights Commission, which is, I must remind some of your listeners, the same institution that prosecuted Penny Sparrow. Initially, in some of our first statements, we were supportive of the South African Human Rights Commission doing an investigation in the hope that it would be able to pressure the university to be honest and quite frank about what is actually happening at the institution. But unfortunately, all we are seeing is the same, shall I say, leftist bureaucratic word salads, which are just being minced out from the university, stating that that Afrikaans will always have a place and always have a home at the university, when tangibly there's a very hostile narrative against Stellenbosch University at this point in time.
Yeah, now the South African Human Rights Commission, as far as I'm concerned, is a complete joke. You know, it doesn't do its job. You mentioned Penny Sparrow. I can think of so many other people. I always think of Vicky Momberg. What
Yes.
happened to her? I mean, it's just. I actually had Vicky Momberg on a live stream about a year ago.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, and she told us the whole story, the whole background to what happened. And when you understand the whole background, you can see that the whole thing was just an emotional event where she was just totally traumatized. But okay, let's get back to Stellenbosch. Now, the thing I find really disturbing about what's happening at universities, like University of Cape Town, where the library mysteriously burnt down when it's in the middle of the university, when they had that fire on Table Mountain. The destruction of things like universities in South Africa by radicalized, largely black people who seem to be associated with the economic freedom fighters is very, very disturbing, because unis like UCT and Stellenbosch had fantastic reputations, and now they've just basically been trashed, aren't they?
Yes, it's very unfortunate, and I personally have received some flack from, shall I say, more radical contemporaries to myself as to why even engage with these institutions if they are if they've ultimately been, and I quote unquote here, have been poisoning our children and our youth for so many years. Why is it that you'd want to try to fight for these institutions? And ultimately, this comes down to a matter of heritage. This comes down to a matter of history. We find ourselves in a place where an identification with things is becoming more and more difficult. And Stellenbosch is the place where I'd say, Afrikaans, or at least the idea, which we can hopefully also go into and further clarify from our previous conversation or live stream, to take that conversation a bit further, because I had some time to digest and, in actual fact, just think and further clarify some of those thoughts which we had spoken about at the time.
Right.
But Afrikaans, I mean, in 1707, Hendrik Beelboot being arrested by the governor had cried, "Ik ben Afrikaner," and that it was the first utterance of such an expression. Now, there have been, amongst many academics and historians, both professional and amateur, have been commenting for numerous years as to what precisely he was actually referring to. Was he in actual fact referring to being an Afrikaner and identifying with the land of Africa, or him identifying with not being part or not having to adhere to a colonial administration? There have been many interpretations of what was meant by this. But ultimately, all of these interpretations are very supportive of some of the historical and, dare I say, heritage in orientation claims, because these places hold very dear significance to both not only our past but ultimately our future. For a tree without roots cannot grow, and these are our historical roots which we are talking about. I mean, Stellenbosch is otherwise known as the Eikenstad, which translated means the oak city. I mean, there are oak trees that are growing in Stellenbosch that come directly from the Teutoburger Wald, which is the Teutoburg forest in Germany, where Hermann the Cherusker had defeated the Romans many, many years ago. And it is in that spirit that Afrikaans ultimately lives on in a place like Stellenbosch, in the Eikenstad. And so, to me, in as far as a person might not be able to change the legislation, but ultimately the symbology is so important. And just because one might lose the fight does not mean one should not fight the fight.
Yeah, look, I what you just said about the oak trees in Stellenbosch. Look, that it is one of the most beautiful areas of South Africa. Absolutely gorgeous. Now, let's get back to navigating Southern Africa in the 21st century. Okay, let's start off. Tell us about your Anglo-Afrikaner Union, so people get a better idea as to what it's all about.
Well, I mean, at this particular point in time, I'm putting together a manifesto as well as a plot forward in relation to a potential expression for what this union can look like. This is now between the Anglo-Afrikaner and the Afrikaner. Now, if I may, I've received a lot of questions in relation to, well, Dean, precisely what is an Anglo-Afrikaner, because a lot of people have more or less a conception as to what an Afrikaner is. Well, if I can perhaps use an illustration of an Anglophone European people in South Africa, which to some degree had a nation state, and this is something which existed in history. Dare I say that a prototype of the Anglo-Afrikaner was perhaps the Rhodesian, in a manner of speaking.
Right.
Where you have an Anglophile people that have found themselves in Africa, and in as much as UDI very evidently would declare it was a nation and a people who ultimately felt betrayed and decided to go their own way. And I think that in many people who I would consider to be Anglo-Afrikaners have shared many of the same sentiments, in that they themselves find no affinity with the overseas territories, because they see this as their home. And a person ultimately, as so many liberals point out, a person has no choice into where or how one is birthed into. So in this respect, I'd say that the Anglophile section within South Africa really has a chance now to be able to redefine itself. It is seen quite evidently that positioning itself as an opposition to the only other, shall I say, Eurocentric people which they can otherwise have some meaningful interaction with in Africa, has ultimately been to their detriment. In our last conversation, we had spoken about Alan Patton, and we mentioned his wife, and in actual fact, she immigrated in 2011 out of South Africa, to despite being someone which was very much in favor of a transformation. Well, I don't think they were aware that sometimes things can go really wrong, and sometimes utopia cannot come into existence when confronted with reality. And so the Anglo-Afrikaner, when now faced with reality, has a chance. I mean, I was referring to the Rhodesians, but ultimately they themselves did not have a chance, because them and their own identity was basically formed around a nation who was named after a man. You see, Rhodesia itself being named after Cecil John Rhodes, which in a lot of ways, many Anglophones I find carry that spirit in a manner of speaking. But as many critics of the Anglo-Afrikaners in South Africa have otherwise pointed out, these majority being Afrikaners, of course, have pointed out them to being overtly gentlemanlike, believing that diplomacy will be able to solve a lot of our problems that we are facing, So, in a manner of speaking, I feel that the Anglo-Afrikaner now, or at least this particular identity, because we are in a time of identity, and it's so important that people are able to ground themselves in who they are, and identity is very important in that, particularly when one considers some of the torrid winds and torrid storms which are going to lie ahead of us as we go into the 21st century. So the Anglo-Afrikaner has a chance to sort of shed the Rhodes mentality and enter into post-liberalism, to move away from ultimately ideologies that poison his family, his society, and ultimately his future.
Okay, now you used the words poison his future,
Yes.
and I think you're talking about the culture there. I just want to get back to that in a second, but you talked about Alan Patton's book, Cry the Beloved Country. Now,
Yes.
I've just been, well, I was sent last week a new book that's coming out in the next month or so, and it's called Mourn the Beloved Country.
Mourn the Beloved Country.
Mourn the Beloved Country. And it's actually a South African who grew up pre-1994, talking about life back then and talking about what has happened now with the corruption and what's going on. And it's a fascinating insight. And the reason I got a pre-release copy is because he asked me to write the foreword for that book, which I've done.
Oh, lovely.
And it's a really interesting insight into what's happening in South Africa. And, when it comes to Anglo-Afrikaners and et cetera, I have two nicknames on Loving Life, that people call me. One is the old fart, okay, because I'm an old guy. and the other one is the Anglo-Boer, because I'm right in the camp of the Boer people, the Afrikaner people, because I can see the persecution that they're going through. Now, I'd like you to expand. Again, you used the word about the poison attached to their culture. Don't you think that the culture of the Boers is probably the greatest strength they have, because it bonds them together? They've got their moral compass is so strong compared to other cultures where there's absolutely no moral compass at all. I think this is what defines that sector of the white community in South Africa. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, you see, I think there's just one point that I think a person should take up, and this is in relation to our last conversation which we'd had, and that is the Boer Afrikaner, what would the right term be? I suppose issue that some people have, and I thought a lot about this, and in particular, the Afrikaner as an identity was a national identity, which was a concept which, if we set aside, like I had mentioned, the Ik ben Afrikaner of Hendrik Beelboot, in a manner of speaking, the first formalization was under the Genootschap of Regter Afrikaners, which only came into being in the late 1880s, or the early 1880s, I apologize, or the late 1870s. But the Boer states, as nation states, had come into existence somewhat before that, and I'm referring more specifically to the Orange Free State, and more specifically to the Transvaal, not so much the lesser territories, which were either incorporated into other territories or ultimately, yes, no longer existed as independent republics. But what I thought about is that normally one could consider these particular states to and the subsequent union, I suppose, to be something similarly along the line of a German confederation, where German was ultimately considered the national identity of what eventually became the German Empire under Otto von Bismarck. But it had to do with the incorporation of regional identities under a standard, a national standard. And so when a person looks at the story of the Afrikaner, particularly as he rose into the post Anglo-Boer War, into in particularly the 30s, the 40s, on their way to ultimately seizing political power in the nation. And one sees the drive that had transpired with the Groot Trek in 1938, the centenary thereof, and how this year was a factor that brought all Afrikaans speaking people of European descent in South Africa together and rallied them behind this particular very strong symbol, which a person could also say is not only a cultural or not only a cultural symbol, but is ultimately a mythological symbol. It is the origin of the people, in a manner of speaking.
You know, the
And so,
Afrikaans history is absolutely mind blowing. I mean, there's so many different facets to it, and there's so many times where they have been persecuted, like by the British, the Boer War, with these concentration camps and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, let's move on a bit.
mm,
How does one in these completely stuffed up times in South Africa determine one's own destiny?
well, yeah, I suppose a person should first be able to have to distinguish between, I suppose, the individual's destiny and then the collective's destiny, I suppose. Because there's the direction which one takes, and then I suppose there's a direction which society takes. I mean, at this point in time, we see that there are sections of society that are moving along with the government mandated injections, and then there are other sections of society who are not, for example. So first there's that, but ultimately these movements within in society, they're ultimately determined by individuals who then ultimately move in this collective. So when one is to consider how one was navigating the 21st century, one has to look at what is no longer working first and foremost. And what we are seeing is that specifically technology has outstripped the evolution of our sociological organization, of which something like a nation state is ultimately a sociological construction. In a nation state does not objectively exist. It is a parameter that is otherwise drawn up and mutually agreed by the people that otherwise exist within those parameters. What generally has underpinned most of the nation states has been this concept of the social contract, whereby one would exchange some of one's own personal rights in exchange for the protection of others. And this here was a formula which had, in some sense, brought about some of the world's greatest equality in the West. I mean, it's always so strange to consider that by the 1950s, America was the most equal nation on earth. Cars used to be more expensive than houses, to put it in perspective.
Right.
So But you see, how these changes have happened have also been because of these individual decisions that has created, which has led to a collective shift in the whole of society. So what we are seeing is now is that the state is, or at least the concept, in as much as the current state has been put together, is crumbling.
Yeah, well, just this week you can see what's happening within the ANC when it comes to Ace Magashule trying to undermine Ramaphosa, and Ramaphosa playing a big role in getting Ace Magashule arrested. That's a
Yes, it's
story for
clown.
another day. But it just represents a complete lack of moral compass within that organization. Now, let's talk about the Stellenbosch report, and tell us about that and your work as the Anglo-Afrikaner Union within Stellenbosch.
Well, you see, what has been vitally important in this time is to be able to take up this particular battle, particularly in terms of its symbology, as I've described. I mean, Stellenbosch is the second oldest town in South Africa. Throughout the years, there has been a very large demographic change that has transpired, but this demographic exists in different forms. Often people, when speaking of the terms demographics, often people consider this in the terms of race. But in this respect, I don't even have to refer to it in those terms because, see, the amount of the amount of home speaking, or rather, so to say, primary language Afrikaans speakers, the number in 2008, right, is equated now to the number of home speaking English speakers at the university. What has happened is that there's been a complete inversion that has transpired at the university in terms of its language. What has happened at Stellenbosch is that Stellenbosch is slowly but surely allowed in many English speakers from schools that would traditionally feed into places like UCT or WITS or otherwise a UP. The unfortunate backward tumbling of those universities had resulted in many students from all over the country otherwise applying to Stellenbosch University. So what this allowed for is ultimately this intermingling of English speakers and Afrikaans speakers in one university. There isn't another university that's comprised in the same way as Stellenbosch, and there never has been such a university comprised in the same way as Stellenbosch University. Not in our history, by any rate, that we've had such a dualistic medium where these two particular cultures, and in some respect, if we could perhaps set aside for a moment the concept that tertiary education is a money-making scheme, then a person could consider that what you are having is a culmination of the best of particular generations coming together at this institution. That's ultimately what universities are supposed to be.
Yeah,
Is the bringing together of young people, and what we've been seeing over time is the slow disenfranchisement of young people in South Africa and within its states institutions, within many different aspects in South Africa. And so the question is, how on earth does a young person, what does a young person do in this sense of hopelessness that they find themselves in? Now, a lot of people have often asked, why is it that young people are so interested in get-rich-quick schemes? And for young people, the chances of things such as home ownership, for example, or adequate wealth generation seem so far out of their reach. I mean, if you're someone who's scraping by, making less than 10,000 rand a month, your ability to purchase a home is just impossible practically.
Yeah.
But considering the way things are going, and considering how inflation has otherwise been taking hold in many different parts of the world, I mean, in places like America, now we have both fuel shortages as well as lumber shortages, and construction all over the country has come to a complete halt. But nonetheless, what we find ourselves in is a time when there are very unique shortages and problems coming to the fore. And when you look at South Africa, we have a average age of 25, right?
Right.
Which is quite significant. That means that there's a very large proportion of the country that is youthful, and this is generally very good when one considers how a country moves forward into the future. Generally, young populations tend to be more creative. They tend to have more free energy, in a manner of speaking, at their disposal. So their capacity to do and engage in activities which would otherwise be considered very physical is far more within their grasp. The capacity to address the world through new lenses in an ever-changing world is so much more to their capacity. Young people today have found themselves in a position where they've become so integrated into the information system that their capacity to be informed is actually greater than ever before.
Now, I've just got a thought for you on this particular subject, and I'm talking about affirmative action in South Africa.
Mm.
There's absolutely
Yes.
no doubt in my mind that when it comes to choosing students who might be doing medicine or might be doing engineering or whatever it is at university, are not chosen based on merit. They're chosen based on the color of their skin. And you've got some top white matric students who get 7 straight A's and apply to go into medicine at, let's say, UCT, and they get knocked back. And then you get other people from other races who might have average C's, and they get accepted into that same particular area, in medicine. And I think that dumbing down the unfairness of the situation, because those people who are going to university today were never part of the apartheid system. They're too young. And here they are being ostracized. And I think that this is a huge issue in South Africa today when we talk about the university system and where it's going into the future. Because I understand now that there are some countries where engineering degrees from South Africa after a particular year are not recognized because they say that those people haven't got the real qualifications. This is what's happening around the world, the recognition that the university system in South Africa is failing.
Yes, most definitely, and this is why a lot of some of my contemporaries have also criticized me in my wanting to nonetheless protect these particular institutions. The large issue is that these institutions are made of the people that occupy them. So as William Shakespeare used to say, nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So when it comes to considering an institution such as the Stellenbosch University, one can consider the administration, as we've now seen with the utterances from Director de Villiers and his defense against much of the allegations that have been made. And ultimately we are dealing with an institution, which is the South African Human Rights Commission, which is overseen by the National Assembly, trying to investigate another state institution. So again, we find ourselves very much in a circular, the government has created a problem that only it can solve. This is very problematic in as far as the ability to address these problems go, particularly at perhaps the last university in South Africa that still has that particular outside recognition, which is something that Stellenbosch prides itself upon, and rightfully so. They receive a myriad of university students and international students from all over the world. And if in that case, referring to the whole Afrikaner culture, if anything, I think a place where Afrikaner culture had been illustrated, at least by any rate, which is definitely what the strategists at Luthuli House understand. is that a capitulation of Stellenbosch would be a win in morale for their capacity to reach their young people. Because if they're able to show that they were able to turn the home of apartheid into a Zania University, and be able to transmute it away from its foundations, that they will be able to deliver a better tomorrow for young people in South Africa. But obviously, this is but a political honeypot.
But that there's a complete disconnect in what you just said, because what they're going to do is not be better for students or young people going through university. It's going to be incredibly worse.
Yes, a very good illustration of this particular youth disenfranchisement is that student politics is always an illustration of young people's engagement with national politics. Young people are not involved in the decision-making processes. I mean, at Stellenbosch University, for example, I think barring the last SRC election, for about 5 years running, they were having an average of about 30% of the student body that was otherwise taking part in the SRC, that's the Student Representative Council elections.
Right.
So what you have now is that you have 30% of the student body, which are determining basically choosing the people who determine the framework of how students in the institution are supposed to interact with one another. I mean, this is precisely what people complain about in as far as South Africa. It's democratic demographics go. That the majority of people are ruled by a minority of people who have decided to take part in the decision making process, whether or not incentivized or otherwise.
If you look at the University of Cape Town, for example, the EFF have got their own student representative council at that university, and they're trying to push their agenda, aren't they?
Yes. I mean, what else can one truly expect? I mean, they themselves have their own agenda to push, and the only reason why they have been making the type of advancements that they have is because, and this is the true of the whole left, in actual fact. So much so that liberals are such as now that has been happening recently with a lot of Helen Zille's interviews, where she's calling upon liberals to stand up against the wokeness. But the issue is that the wokeness, its roots and its characteristics ultimately belie itself in liberalism. So it's sort of asking the lizard or the snake to eat itself.
Yeah.
This is quite typical of what happens within many leftist organizations. They eventually always turn into an Ouroboros, that is the snake that eats itself.
It's socialism and communism, isn't it? Now, I see you've got a picture of Ian Smith, a man that I admire greatly, behind you on the wall. You know, his vision for Rhodesia and the way he was betrayed by South Africa back in the early 1970s, when Henry Kissinger flew over and had that meeting with, I think it was P.W. Botha. And
yes, he was Minister of Defense at the time.
Yeah, and you know, it's a tragedy when you look at how Southern Africa was back then and how it is today. It's two different worlds, isn't it?
You see, again, to my mind, it comes down to young people. At the time, the politicians had seen young people not as people to carry forward the flame of civilization, but rather saw them as cannon fodder for the border. That's how politicians saw it. They now, of course, the state-run broadcast corporation was illustrating a completely different story. You know, and this is ultimately what had led to a lot of English people to come into very heavy criticism of the apartheid regime because of the miscommunication of what was truly happening on the border. Instead, you know, many of the politicians in the National Party, for them, politics was a party. It was not something to be taken serious because, you know, they themselves would never have conceived that the National Party would ever come to an end, or at least those that were not in the know by any rate. And so we find ourselves at the position again where young people were ultimately sold out. I mean, I would say this much, Scott. I mean, at some point you were not an old fart, but rather a young fart. And at that point in
I was a
time,
young fart back then, yes.
yes, and at that point in time, there were decision makers who were in place who had made decisions which, I mean, they'd made decisions that ultimately affected you so much so that you live on a different continent now.
Yeah,
So much
exactly.
so that we are having this particular conversation about these particular things.
Yeah,
But you see, the thing is that now we find ourselves in the 21st century. It is no longer possible for us to hold people of the past accountable because a lot of them aren't even here anymore. Many of the so-called, I suppose, the people, the benefactors of the apartheid regime are in as far as individuals go. I'm not really referring to other entities that have been able to carry over the residual benefit.
Broederbond.
But yeah, well, the and affiliates, I suppose, to say the least. But you see, not all of these organizations have largely not seen young people as the carriers of the ideal of an organization. They rather see them as a trailer or something, a var, a sleepvar at the end. It's not something that is supposed to ignite and drive forward these movements. And I mean, this is why largely our focus at the Anglo-Afrikaner Union has been to drive forward to the youth, because ultimately they're the people that are going to have to become part of the decision-making process. Otherwise, decisions will be made for them. Now, whether or not taking part in the decision-making structures is worth it is a matter of assessment from circumstance to circumstance. South Africa, in terms of its administrations, wherever one might be, is sometimes very often determined just by the staff that occupy that office,
Right.
and is sometimes not as structurally hardcore as otherwise people might interpret. But that's definitely not always the case. In some places, there are chronic administration problems. But what this means is that it enables us and puts us into a position to see the problems for what they are and be able to work towards alternatives and move away from the victim mentality that we are otherwise entrapped in. In all honesty, if the EFF has a student command at the UCT, all the more power to them. We are ultimately engaged in the war of ideas. But what that means is that if I find myself not able to fight in that field, then that means that I need to create my own field
Right.
upon which I'm then able to fight. And so this is what our focus is at the Anglo-Afrikaner Union, is to basically be able to establish a meta-political view, which is past the politics, so that a person can actually work to trying to get the best of our people to work together, especially our young people, because they are people that have been exposed, in particular, to the new technologies that are otherwise most likely going to drive forward the future. I mean, we can take a look at some of the technologies have been coming to the fore, particularly the digital and information age has only just begun in many respects, and South Africa, and in particular places like Cape Town, has tried to put itself in a position where it can become the so-called IT hub of at least by any rate Southern Africa. So when we look at some of the new technologies which have been coming up, um, we well first I had completely forgotten this. It's actually first very important to understand what we are leaving, I suppose, right? We are leaving an old world going into a new, and I mean that there is quite evident by there are some people who feel that the Great Reset is a charade to hide something else that's happening, or all the finer details as to the fact that something is happening.
Well,
And
I have to dispute that, because one thing that
mm,
I've noticed, and I do a lot of research, is
yes,
that the people who are basically running the world, and we know that there are
mm,
people who are running the world, that the big bankers and those sort of guys, they always telegraph what they're going to do. They don't hide it. There's so many
brazenness.
examples of this. And when you had Klaus Schwab last year from the World Economic Forum saying there is going to be a great reset, because of this COVID lockdown, and we can have our own conspiracy theories about what was behind that, and I certainly have mine. But the tragedy is I can't talk about those on a platform like YouTube without them taking down that video because it goes against their own narrow agenda. So the censorship that's now taking place on the internet through the big platforms is quite extraordinary. My main Loving Life channel, which has nearly 100,000 subscribers, it is locked down for another 10 days because it got another community strike. I can't put a video up there for 10 more days. It's like you're in the naughty box. It is so childish. It's so pathetic. And my sin was because I dared to discuss a subject which they deem to be medical misinformation. And I'm not even going to go into what we discussed because then they'll give this channel a copyright strike as well.
Strike.
You know, or, sorry, a community strike. It
Yes.
is absolutely disgusting what's going on in the world today. So when we talk about this transition from the old world to the new world, where we've got technology becoming the focus of our future, the really disturbing issue, and I'd like your thoughts on this, is that it's been kind of cramped into a piece of space that suits the agenda of those who are controlling the world today. And if you take a step out of that, they're going to shut you down. That's why we've got our own platform now called lovinglifetv.com, because no one can do that to us. We can talk openly about these things, which you can no longer on these big platforms. What are your thoughts about how we're being suppressed by this these people who want to control the world?
Well, I'll tell you this much: they're trying to control a world that is falling apart. What we are experiencing now, it's quite strange that they ultimately chose a medical pandemic, a medical occurrence to bring about this change, as though almost a band-aid to sort of hold it all together as we transition from the so-called old world into the new world. But I personally, I feel it's very short-sighted, and definitely the brazenness through which they are putting out what they're trying to do. I mean, I'm very grateful for their brazenness, because arrogance comes before the fall. And at this point in time, their brazenness has enabled me to be able to plot my own future forward. I don't, if I can put it that way, it has forced us to focus on being solution orientated. That's what these circumstances have forced us to be.
Absolutely.
But you see, there are these fears that ultimately are come through from the old world and are very tangible. I feel that this particular way to go about things as it's chosen is ultimately short-sighted, because how do you leave behind some of the serious problems that the old world has created? And more specifically, I'm referring to things such as debt, currency inflation, energy devaluation. I mean, they have now legislated censorship into place. You can't unlegislate that. I mean, we are looking at systemic healthcare collapse, but I find, and more specifically, and perhaps most importantly, we come out of the old world with what I call ecological unawareness. And I'd just like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to just quickly read a definition for what that means, and my potential antidote to that as well is something which I feel you might find rather interesting, and that is ecology is the study of relations of living organisms to the environment, the study of ecosystems, and the study of environmental conditions of existence. Well, you see, at this point in time, we've been living in a state of strong ecological unawareness. We've been living in a way that we no longer, and we started to realize that because we've been hurtling towards it, and that is that we are living in a way that doesn't relate to either people or the work we do, or our economy, or our government, or our family, or the things where we derive most of our time and meaning from, have no longer have any relevance to us. I mean, so often do people do things, and then afterwards they feel guilty and horrible about having done it, and that largely comes from this lack of awareness or ultimately connectivity. But again, I feel this is strongly connected to one's shall I say, one's inability to self-identify. Because if you have no identity, how can one self-actualize
Right.
in any way?
Well, I think that's what's happened in the United States is that they've completely lost their way forward. They don't know where they're going. You got these movements like Black Lives Matter, which are basically destroying the country from the foundation up.
Well, more specifically, they're destroying the people who are part of these movements, and I think more specifically that there is also very important. In as far as uh, uh, shall I say, the plans of the puppeteers goes, to keep people in unawareness, to so keep the division in place. These things are very much required. I mean, the biggest fear that they can ultimately have is that people can realize that that the differences that exist between them are being exploited first and foremost, and that should make them mad. That must make them angry. Because if a person doesn't get angry first, I mean, how can you change anything if it doesn't make you angry? If it
But don't you
doesn't
think
madden you in some way?
don't you think they're indoctrinated? Isn't that the big problem? Because nowadays, when you go to school, they're basically pushing down your throat their perspective on things. It's no longer it's no
Yes,
longer how it used to be with the old moral standards and stuff like that. Today, it's a completely new agenda, which has been put into schools by people like the Open Society Foundation, which is George Soros, who've clearly got their own agenda when it comes to indoctrinating the youth of today. And you can see the fruits of that with things like Antifa, Black Lives Matter, which are both, by the
yes.
way,
Well,
funded by the Open Society Foundation.
well, you see, Scott, all that has happened is that they have exploited the cracks in the foundations of our communities. That's all that's happened.
And that's a family
It's
unit.
it's amongst other things. I mean, you see, often one's enemy is an illustration of the weak points inside oneself. So when one feels affronted by what is happening, one needs to perhaps look back. And this is where, I mean, my answer towards the ecological and awareness is ecological intelligence. And if I may read a definition for intelligence from Hauser, that is the capacity to learn from experience, to think in abstract or symbolic terms, and to deal effectively with one's environment. The capacity of an animal to use tools to solve problems, to find its way home, and to learn by imitation. And I feel that ecological intelligence is the only way that we can truly be able to answer some of the questions which we are facing in South Africa, because that means that a person needs to come to a state of sincere honesty with what one is faced with. I
Now
mean, we are faced with, yes,
that brings us to the future of South Africa. And I'm not just talking about South Africa. I'm talking about the world because if we could look into a looking glass with the USA, I think people would say, "Wow, that country's in a whole lot of trouble." South Africa, for different reasons, is in a whole lot of trouble. How do the youth of South Africa turn this around? Because they're going to be the leaders of tomorrow. How do they turn around this mess?
well, I think it's very important that a person let go of delusion. Firstly, that a person is able to come into contact with what reality actually is. Now, I know people might dispute and say that reality is somewhat um, relative, because how one chooses to see the world is how one perceives the world. But there are nonetheless some immutable laws, which are the laws of nature, and that is that, in particularly in as far as the earth goes, in as far as biological organisms go, we are in a state of competition at this point in time. These competitions have become very abstract. Generally, competitions are conflicts in as far as two adversaries would meet one another. And what we've been seeing is, you'd mentioned, in places such as America, or I would say even furthermore places like China or India, and all of these different places that now hold substantial volumes of capital to be able to determine the so-called future of the world. Well, if a person bases oneself upon a system that is collapsing, if you put all your eggs in the basket that is falling, then inevitably the eggs will not last. So what one needs to do is that one needs to be able to learn both from the old and the new world. This is very difficult for people because it requires a foot in the old and a foot in the new. And that requires a sense of realism that is sometimes very hard to come by, because when one is set in what the reality actually is, and that is ultimately that group dynamics is a factor on planet Earth, and that groups are in competition against all other groups. And at this point in time, most groups, when considering a fact, they look and consider, well, is it good for me? Is it good for us? And then do they consider, is it good for others? What has happened is that there's been an internalized form of intolerance, almost a type of a grammar, if you will, a grammar of intolerance that has been, shall I say, ingrained into people of Western descent, that there is no future for them. I mean, Scott, I don't know if you enjoy sci-fi or science fiction movies, but when one looks at the science fiction movies of the past and these science fiction movies looking into the future, it wasn't dystopic. It was not a story of the future being a dystopia, a wasteland, some apocalyptic zombie natured type of world. No. Many of these illustrations of the future were optimistic, were hopeful, believed that the world would be moving towards the better. Now, many people, such as say Dr. Jordan Peterson, amongst others, have pointed out. I'm only using him because people who know who I'm talking about. There are obviously many other people that have pointed this out, but that in general, people have been overall becoming more wealthier and been moving away from the poverty line and the bread line, and has overall started to generate more wealth and capacity than ever before in history. But at what cost is this coming, is the question that needs to be asked. At a tremendous cost, I feel. At a cost where, when one considers the future, I mean, we just look at South Africa. Short-term gain at long-term loss is in no way the way to go. And unfortunately, our current structure has forced power and decision-making to be forced into time spans that do not allow for long-term thinking. The capacity for things such as statecraft, which is ultimately the construction of how a framework is supposed to be and how it must ultimately interact with itself. That they would then translate into policy, wherein policy is the execution of the framework in actuality. So you'd have the conceptualizers who would say, well, listen, this is what we would like to be able to achieve. Then you would have the administrators and bureaucrats and bean counters and lawyers who would then determine how to achieve that particular goal. So now we find ourselves in a position where in South Africa we have not had this type of long-term planning, which has resulted in a destruction of many, at least in the public sphere. This is definitely the case, less so than in the private sphere. But the public sphere has destroyed much of its environmental resource, its natural resources, its intellectual capital. It has tarnished its institutions to the point that nobody can trust them. I mean, going to the bank, they won't accept an affidavit from the police. I mean, you
Yeah.
know, that's the state of affairs which we're dealing with. We're dealing with a society which is suffering from mistrust or a lack
Can
of
I
trust.
can I just put a thought in here, Dean, and that
Yes,
is that
please.
I see, we're talking about the the old world and the new world. I think what's happened in the current situation, not just in South Africa but around the world, is that it's what I call the now generation, the now generation, because
Mm,
what they're all about is instant gratification. When I was a young man, we didn't have computers. We didn't have television sets. I used to spend a lot of time outside in the garden beds, playing around with mud, just being a kid. I
mm.
used to smell the roses. I used to enjoy the sun. I had a totally different upbringing to kids today, where they
Yes.
sit behind an Xbox and they play games 24/7. And if their parents
Mm.
do, or their mother, because they're often a single parent, if the parent tries to tell them to stop, then there's a hissy fit. It's a completely different type of child that's evolved. And I think with the technology and what's going on in the world today, that is a huge part of the problem when we talk about the future. How do we
Mm.
resolve that? Because the old world, where you used to go out and walk through a park, and you know you're talking about the ecology a moment ago, you used to appreciate things around you, and that seems to have been lost. It seems to be now just a computer screen and playing computer games, or it's a completely different type of person that's evolving.
Yeah, most definitely. I must also point out, Scott, that generations, at least I should say, uh, perhaps a generation or two generations just before you, children were considered little adults that would have to go work in factories and sell newspapers. The position of what children are has changed drastically as society has progressed. Children had gone from only being meaningful once they had reached adolescence. I mean this in a very broad sense. I must also say, um, society was very different about 150 years ago. Even I mean, infant mortality was something that was generally experienced um,
150
by
years
most.
ago, they didn't have the car.
Yes, no,
I mean, that's how
society.
fast society has changed or evolved. It's incredible.
Dare I say that there was an older old world than the one which we are even talking about at this point in
Yeah.
time, you know. And so it's
I,
now
I
one has to consider that if that is how quickly things have changed, how does one even look into the future? How does one plan for anything when change is seemingly becoming so exponential and there's just such an overload of information that people struggle to be able to discern between what information is useful for them because all that is really useful for a person in one respect is your time, which is ultimately your energy or however one wishes to express it.
yeah.
So if one receives information, then one needs to be able to discern whether or not this information is even worth ingesting, because it'll take your time. And never in my life have I ever been so inundated with information from so many different sources. It's mind-boggling. How does then a person is caught up with the question, how does one make a decision? Because at some point you have to say, okay, that's enough information. I need to plan what I'm going to do now with what I know, because otherwise a person will be constantly stuck in the loop of just gathering more and more and more information, and eventually in some cases, has become an obsession uh, has been shown in movies to be that illustration of a person who has all these newspaper clippings with strings and so on all over their wall. But with the internet, it's become a bit more efficient. You
Yeah.
need a lot less wall space, to say the least. So
Yeah.
uh, the capacity for people to actually ingest and digest information to make meaningful decisions in their life is also another thing which is very new in our time. But what that's allowed for is the invention of technologies that in technologies such as blockchain or even cryptocurrencies, which have ultimately allowed a whole new conception of future decentralization. I mean, in our last podcast, we had spoken a bit about things such as Western Cape independence and the like. And for such unique circumstances to be addressed, one will need to look at all of the mechanisms that are otherwise available to one to be able to establish, self-actualization, which in a certain respect is self-determination, or at least enables you to determine one's own destiny. A person has to ask, where does one wish to go? Does one wish to be swept up by which some people might call madness and other people might call saneness, I
Dean,
suppose?
talking about self-determination, don't you think that's lost in the smoke and mirrors of indoctrination when you're at school, because you're basically taught to think a certain way, so your self-determination is basically clouded?
Well, I will say this much, is that there are people who go through these institutions and are never brainwashed. So it is not that these institutions are not powerful or do not have an effect on people's capacity to think, but the people who you want by your side are the people who are never who saw right through it.
Yeah.
And if anything, what we're experiencing is like they say in Afrikaans, 'n skuif in die kaf in die byl' at this point in time.
Yeah.
Within our society and within our relationships, also more broadly speaking, which is ultimately what society is made of. Society is made of relationships,
Yeah.
and this ecological intelligence has to do with how people are, the understanding of how to relate in relationships. I mean, people today are finding themselves more and more estranged than ever before, and are using technology as a means to prompt interaction with
Fill the gap.
real people. Yes.
Now,
Okay, now a person could go into why this gap has been created, but that I suppose
yeah.
is a whole different story unto itself as well.
Look, we touched on ecology, and we're talking about the future. Um,
Mm.
the reality is that man cannot exist without drinking water. And if you look at what's happening to a lot of the farmlands today, they're going to desert. The population is increasing dramatically. This is the elephant in the room, because it's going to get to a point where there's not enough water or not enough food to sustain the population. And we're very fast reaching that point, aren't we?
Well, there's some very unusual occurrences which are occurring at this point in time. You see, there's been an increase in unemployment, but there's been a drop in people who are open to being employed.
That's in the US.
More specifically, yes.
Yeah, because they've
But
been
this
paid all
trend,
these big payouts by the government.
yes, but these trends are going to spill out as time moves forward, as more money is being put into the system. So what we are seeing then, and will see as time moves on, is a greater urbanization to the cities, which will put even more strain, particularly on those local sources of both energy and power. Which, if you're so busy dealing with like they say, spoeg en plak, which is just to try and keep things together, your capacity to expand, you will just never meet it.
Yeah.
When one considers what had happened in 2016 with Cape Town, I believe it was 2016, with Cape Town's Day Zero, it was the first country in the world to have experienced such a phenomena where a metropolitan, yes, where a metropolitan had completely run out of water.
Mm.
Now, what has happened subsequently is that they've received more rain, and nobody wants to
Out of
address
sight,
the
out of
fact that
mind. They forget that it'll happen again.
well, you see, the local elections are coming up. We can't talk about things like that.
Mm.
So So
Now,
um,
I just want to
mm,
share with you a comment that Dan Berryman is our resident pastor on Loving Life.
I
And
see. Yes.
Dan said a short while ago that it's very interesting what's happening in Jerusalem at the moment. Now, we're talking about the future as if there is going to be a future, generations going forward in the world.
Mm.
Um, there are a lot of people who believe that we are sitting on the apex of what is called the tribulation. Now, why I said what Dan put in there is so interesting is because right now in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, which is basically the center of what the Bible talks about, is well, the Israeli army have been in there, and they've been. I've seen videos where they're basically throwing smoke into the Temple Mount, and
Mm.
the one thing that still has to happen biblically is that the mosque that's sitting on top of Temple Mount has to go, and a
The
Christian
Dome of the
church
Rock.
has to be on its place on the rock. Yeah, so it's a very very interesting time that we live in, and uh, when you look at what's happening around the world, what we're talking about here could just be irrelevant if God shows his hand in the next 10, 15 years and you know, basically takes us to his kingdom. It's a very, very interesting time. What are your thoughts about what's happening in places like Jerusalem?
Well, I can say that, but it's not the first time that people have felt that way. Yeah, I mean,
Mm, mm,
in many times that Israel has been attacked throughout its history,
yeah,
people have felt that there's some divine connection between it and essentially the revelation or the um, some people, despite it being absent, even connotate such times to being related to the rapture, or at least the concept thereof.
yeah,
But you see, myself personally, I have sworn an oath to my people, so I cannot. I have to act in accordance with that. I cannot take stock on the fact that because tomorrow might carry on, if I can put it that way.
absolutely.
And it's not that a person does not believe that some event like that can happen, but I have fortunately uh, there's a faculty in one that that forces one to still continue fighting. I mean, many people have stated that if one was to interpret things in such a manner that, you know, jy hang jou hoed op en los dit alles in die hande van die Here. You hang your hats up and you leave it all in the hands of God. Many people don't read the next line is that one's, God's hands is yours here on earth, I suppose one could say. So, yeah, I work from the perspective that the things are going to carry on. It will become a lot worse, yes. And I mean, naturally, as greater persecution comes, people will sense that these things ultimately align. But it's confusing because we have a lot of people claim that there's a war against people of European descent, and that there's also been a war against Christianity. Well, the war against Christianity has been important in that it otherwise allowed structure for society in where people of European descent would otherwise find themselves. So, if you attacked the church, you'd be able to destroy the congregation. People's capacity to come together would become destroyed. And I mean, they've been doing this with all institutions up until the point that they even banned alcohol. Like the in some sense most degenerative accepted form of people coming together in a manner of speaking. So what's been happening in respect to Jerusalem? I mean, there have been quite a few people that have that I know that had also gone through to the pro-Palestinian marches, and there were also people that I know that have gone through in support of the Israeli government. Now, the Israeli government finds itself in a position where it has only recently chosen a government. It has had about, I believe, between 3 and 4 elections in the past 2 years. They've not had a stable government, and their capacity to adequately, at least from a political perspective, be able to address the situation which is currently ongoing in Jerusalem is very difficult for them because of the various different factions that exist within the new Israeli coalition. Israeli politics is a massive spectrum of incredible liberal politics to incredibly almost to ultra nationalist politics
Well,
within
I
one
should say
state.
that Netanyahu is someone who concerns me, just as a person, the things he does, and the fact that they've basically now vaccinated the entire population in Israel, and they're ostracizing those who refuse to have the vaccination. It, as I say, we're living in biblical times. This is extraordinary that a country like Israel would be making people submit to a mandated vaccine at this time when, yeah, I'm not going to go there because I don't want YouTube having a go at this video. But this is the craziness of the times that we live in.
Most definitely. And, they always spoke about things reaching things such as peak oil, or, peak energy, yeah, utmost energy devaluation, that they would be the first thing which we would hit before going down the intrepid roller coaster of a dysfunctional monetary policy and economy. But little did I think a person could expect that we would first hit peak insanity, in a manner of speaking, before we would ever come to near to some peak resource issue. Modern society is, or rather, should I say, the brainchild of post-modernity, which is what modern society is something that leaves people unhealthy and sick. This is a matter of fact.
Yeah.
So what we're dealing with here is a systemic issue, and this is why things such as statecraft and policy making, as I mentioned earlier, they're actually vitally important, and people's capacity to get involved is equally important, because you need to determine the future in which one would live.
Yeah.
So that means that a person must be able to become part of that process. But how, people always question, how does the individual do something? Because what they've ensured over the time, both the corporation and governments, or rather, should I say, yes, I should say governments, and furthermore using then the implements of the state, have atomized people to the point that they feel powerless, utterly and completely powerless. But I mean, this is evidently not. This is only true in as much as individuals don't decide things in the same direction. This was evident with what had happened quite recently with Coca-Cola and its anti-diversity program.
That was just so crazy. We're opening up a can of worms here. We could talk about this for 4 months, literally, because it is such a huge topic. Dean, I want to just, I think we've pretty well covered the areas that we decided to discuss. Is there something that you feel that you want to raise? Because I'm going to be wrapping up the live stream in about the next 5 to 10 minutes, because we've been going for 90 minutes, so it's been a really interesting chat.
I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah. Now, is there something you'd like to just raise that perhaps you feel needs to be raised in this discussion?
I would like to just raise a very hot potato, and that is this: is that if you want to be able to split society in two, you just create distrust between men and women.
Right.
And that has been something that particularly corporations have been very good at. In sowing the distrust between men and women, these things have mutually reflected back upon men and women internally. And both parties have become very self-aware or rather, should I say, have rather gained self-esteem. Now, self-esteem is an American term in as far as psychology goes. It means the value of oneself, and it's a very broken assessment of things because the value of oneself cannot be determined by one's estimation, because estimation is always a yardstick which is outside of oneself. And so what we have is it's such an unusual occurrence because we say people who have low self-esteem, they tend to be very self-aware. So what is quite evident in this year falls, I suppose, in line with the ecological intelligence concept, is that self-awareness is probably the most important thing which we need right now. And the reason why I say that is because so often so often is it possible. And I mean, a good example. I mean, I was walking in a forest well, not quite recently actually. We were walking in a park here nearby, completely alone, a dog park near a river, and we were just watching, and we were sitting by the river, and we were talking. And all of a sudden, as we were talking, he stopped and he looked over his shoulder, completely alone. Us two at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So, and he looked over before he made a politically incorrect utterance. So, despite being completely alone in the park with no one to see, what happened was is that there was a mental block that first needed to be passed. There was a checkpoint, a mental checkpoint that needed to be passed. The, shall I say, self-inflicted Stasi needed to come knock on the door of one's thoughts before one could speak. The place where oppression has truly transpired in and against the European man today has been himself and within himself. It has been the language which we use to speak to ourselves. The self-hatred which has grown in and amongst particularly people of European descent seem very strange to outgroups who they look at it in very strange bemusement, because how is it that one could hate oneself so much when one considers what oneself is? And this is why a understanding of one's own historical reckoning is very important, because other groups are very aware of our history to the point that they demonize us for it.
Yeah.
In actual fact, our enemies are more aware of our history than we are. And what we are finding ourselves in a position to do is a rediscovery in history. But what that means is that we need to rediscover both the masculine and feminine aspects of the European man, to be able to bring together in union both the masculine and the feminine aspects of what makes the people of European descent so beautiful. And we've seen how so many other parts of the world have tried to emulate this beauty in many respects unsuccessfully.
Yeah.
And so we find ourselves in a position where we can build on the beauty of the past and reject the ugliness and injustice of the present.
Yeah. Well, I think the greatest tragedy is the collapse of the family unit. When I was a young man, or not even when I was a young kid, divorce was unheard of. But now it's just par for the course. All right. I'm going to start wrapping up the live stream. Dean, I want to say thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's always a pleasure to have you on, and
Thank you, Scott.
you know, to hear your views on things. Stellenbosch is rather like, I'm talking about Stellenbosch University, is rather like the elephant in the room when it comes to this cultural aspect of what's going on and how the ANC and certain groups are trying to influence its future and the culture within a university that's got a history that goes over 100 years. It's got a wonderfully rich culture and history that's been basically stripped to the bone by you know, the new regime that's in town. But I just want to once again say thank you for joining us tonight to have this chat. To the moderators, thanks guys for keeping an eye on the side chat. As in the next few days, we will be having a large number of contributing channels appearing on lovinglifetv.com, and that's very, very exciting. I'll obviously alert people who watch the live streams when that happens. Please take care. Have a great evening, and thanks, Dean. You take care.
Thank you,
too,
Scott.
and
Thank you.
We'll catch up again soon.
All right, Scott. Have a lovely day, guys, by your side. Hey?
Okay, cheers.
Take care. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you for joining.
All right, guys. I'm going to wrap up now. I'll leave the side chat open for a couple of minutes so you can make or say your goodbyes, and take care. Bye for now.